Eliza Davenport noticed the little things. In a village as small as Althorp, details were hard to ignore. The familiar scent of wild lavender that drifted through the meadows, the sound of birds chirping near the old church at dawn, even the creaking steps outside the bakery each morning as Mr. Calder opened his shop. These were constants in her world, fixed points in an unchanging landscape. But one morning, something was missing. It was subtle at first. Eliza had walked past the Calder house, as she did every day, expecting to catch a glimpse of Emily Calder, her childhood friend, someone she had shared years of friendship with. Emily usually stood by the window, peeking out from behind the curtains before heading into town. But today, there was no sign of her. No light inside the house, no curtains shifting. It wasn't unusual for Emily to be late or even out of sight, but something about the stillness of the house struck Eliza as wrong. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, a quiet, creeping unease. She shook it off, forcing herself to keep walking, blaming her overactive imagination. After all, people didn't just vanish in Althorp. By noon, word had spread that Emily Calder was missing. Or rather, it should have. Eliza wandered into the town square, searching for familiar faces, but when she mentioned Emily's name, she was met with confusion. Emily? Oh, you must mean Mrs. Willow, said Mrs. Ransom, the old woman who worked at the apothecary, adjusting her spectacles as if the name Emily was one she had never heard before. That house has belonged to the Willow family for years now. No Emily Calder ever lived there. Eliza blinked, frozen in place, staring at Mrs. Ransom as though the words hadn't reached her ears properly. But, Eliza began, only to stop as a cold shiver ran down her spine. The house? The one she had walked by every morning? The one where she and Emily had spent their summers playing in the garden? It was now unmistakably different. The ivy that once crawled up its stone walls was gone. The windows, previously chipped and worn, gleamed with fresh paint and unfamiliar curtains. She stood staring at the house for what felt like hours, wondering if somehow she'd lost her mind. Emily Calder had lived there. She had grown up in that house. But now it was as if her friend had never existed. Eliza turned, her heart hammering, and hurried back to her own home. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, rifling through old photo albums, searching for some proof that Emily had been real. Yet, to her growing horror, there were no pictures of Emily in any of them. Birthday parties, summer picnics, Christmas mornings, all of them were there, but the space where Emily should have been was either absent or filled by someone else. Eliza grabbed her phone, her hands trembling, and dialed Emily's number. The line rang endlessly before disconnecting. She tried again, and again. Nothing. It was as though Emily had never existed. By the next morning, the whispers around town had changed. No one seemed to remember Emily Calder at all. Eliza approached neighbors, friends, people who had known Emily their whole lives, and asked about her. Each time she was met with the same bewildered looks. Emily Calder? Never heard of her, they would say with the kind of indifference that gnawed at Eliza's nerves. And then there were the newcomers. A family moved into the Calder house overnight. Eliza didn't see them arrive. One day the house was empty, and the next, they were there, walking around town like they'd lived there all their lives. The Willows, they called themselves, a couple with a young daughter who could have been Emily's age, but something about them didn't sit right with Eliza. Their smiles were too perfect, their voices too smooth, their faces too familiar. Yet when Eliza looked at them, truly looked at them, she felt an instinctual, primal wrongness. She tried not to stare, but one afternoon, as she passed the willows outside the bakery, something strange happened. Mrs. Willow was holding her daughter's hand, waving at a neighbor, when Eliza caught their reflection in the shop window. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat. Their faces were gone. Not gone in the sense of being turned away, not blurred or smudged, but missing entirely. The reflection was wrong, smooth and blank, like a mannequin's without any defining features. Eliza gasped, stumbling back from the window, her heart racing. When she looked directly at them again, their faces were perfectly normal. Mrs. Willow's lips were curved in a polite smile, and her daughter waved shyly, but Eliza could barely breathe, her pulse thudding in her ears. She blinked hard, staring back at the reflection, but the image was gone. Whatever she had seen, or thought she had seen, wasn't there anymore. That night, Eliza lay awake, her thoughts swirling in confusion and fear. Emily was gone. The village had forgotten her, and now strangers with no faces had taken her place. Althorp wasn't the same anymore, and Eliza was the only one who could see it. The morning sun barely peeked over the horizon as Eliza made her way to Mrs. Hartwell's cottage, the old stones of the village pathway damp from the dew. A restless night had left her with dark circles under her eyes, but she couldn't afford sleep. Not now. The faceless reflection of Mrs. Willow haunted her dreams, and the disappearance of Emily gnawed at her mind. There was something more to this, something deep and sinister that ran through the bones of Althorp. She had to find answers. And Mrs. Hartwell, one of the oldest villagers and a keeper of the town stories, might be the key. As Eliza knocked on the weathered wooden door, she hesitated. Would Mrs. Hartwell even remember Emily? Would she dismiss her like everyone else had, with a confused shake of the head? The door creaked open, breaking Eliza's thoughts. "Come in, dear," Mrs. Hartwell's voice rasped from the dimly lit room. "I knew you'd be coming." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. The old woman seemed to always know when something was off, her intuition sharp as a blade. Eliza stepped inside the cottage, taking in the scent of lavender and aged books, as though time itself had stood still in this little home. Mrs. Hartwell led her to the living room, where a kettle was already steaming, and she motioned for Eliza to sit. "You've seen them, haven't you?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The newcomers." Eliza blinked, startled. "You know about them?" "Oh, yes. I've known about them for a long time." Mrs. Hartwell's hands trembled as she poured the tea. "Not many of us left who do." "What are they?" Eliza asked, leaning forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what happened to Emily Calder? Why doesn't anyone remember her?" Mrs. Hartwell sighed deeply, setting down her teacup with a slight rattle. Her gaze drifted to the window, and for a long moment she said nothing, as though she were weighing whether to speak the truth or keep it buried with the village's other secrets. Finally, she turned back to Eliza, her voice low and cautious. "Long ago, before I was even born, this village made a deal, a terrible deal." Eliza felt a chill crawl up her spine, her hands tightening around the cup. "It was during the famine," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "Althorp was on the brink of collapse. Crops had withered, livestock were dying, and people were starving. Desperate, the village council sought out something ancient, something powerful." Eliza swallowed, her mouth dry. "The Faceless ones." Mrs. Hartwell nodded, her weathered face clouded with a mix of fear and regret. The faceless ones are not human, child. They are creatures older than time itself, beings that exist in the shadows of reality. They came to the village, offering a way out, a way to save the people. They promised prosperity, protection, and health for the village, but they demanded something in return. Eliza's pulse quickened. Human lives. "Aye," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice barely more than a whisper. At first, the council agreed to offer them a life every few years. One person would disappear without a trace, but the village would thrive. It was a bargain, a pact sealed in blood and fear. The crops grew, the people flourished, and Althorp became a prosperous place. Eliza shuddered, a sickening feeling rising in her stomach. "But that's not what's happening now, is it?" "No," Mrs. Hartwell said, shaking her head. "Over the years, the faceless ones grew more powerful. They no longer needed to take lives in the same way. Now, they erase people, wipe them from existence entirely. They replace them with their own kind, faceless shadows wearing human skin. And the worst part is, no one remembers the ones who are taken. The village forgets them as if they never lived." Eliza's hands shook, her mind racing. "That's what happened to Emily." Mrs. Hartwell's gaze softened with sorrow. "Yes, Emily is gone now, taken by the faceless ones. In her place, they sent one of their own, a creature that looks human but isn't. They've been doing this for years. One by one, they erase us, and no one remembers the missing." Tears pricked at Eliza's eyes, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. Emily was gone, not just missing, but erased, like a memory wiped clean. And the Willows, the strangers who had moved into her home, they weren't human. The reflection, that blank, faceless visage, flashed through her mind again, sending a shiver down her spine. "Why doesn't anyone fight back?" Eliza asked, her voice barely steady. "Why does everyone just accept this?" "The pact," Mrs. Hartwell replied grimly. "It's ingrained in the village's soul. As long as the faceless ones continue to give prosperity, the council and the villagers turn a blind eye. They've grown comfortable, willing to sacrifice a few to protect the many. The faceless ones have been part of Althorp for so long that people don't even question the disappearances anymore." Eliza's mind reeled, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The council knew. They had to know. They were the ones who had kept the pact alive, who had allowed the faceless ones to thrive here, replacing villagers with their own kind, erasing anyone who might pose a threat. "What about me?" Eliza asked, her voice tightening. "I remember Emily. I can see the newcomers for what they are. Why haven't they taken me?" Mrs. Hartwell's expression darkened. "They will, child. They've already started. The moment you noticed, the moment you began asking questions, you became a target. The faceless ones don't tolerate those who know the truth." Eliza felt a jolt of fear. She thought of how people had started to look at her differently, how even her own family seemed distant. Was it happening already? Were they forgetting her too? "What can I do?" she asked, her voice cracking with desperation. "How do I stop them?" Mrs. Hartwell hesitated before reaching for a faded, leather-bound journal on the table. "There are ways to break the pact, but it's dangerous. The faceless ones are cunning, and they won't let you undo what's been done without a fight. You must be careful, Eliza. Once you've seen them for what they are, there's no going back. They will come for you." Eliza stared at the journal, its pages yellowed with age. Inside there might be the answers she needed, or perhaps just more horrors. Her heart pounded as she took it, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over her. "I'll find a way," Eliza said, her voice firm despite the fear that coiled in her gut. "I won't let them erase me, and I won't let them keep doing this." Mrs. Hartwell nodded, her eyes sad but filled with a quiet hope. "Be careful, child. The faceless ones are everywhere now, watching, waiting." As Eliza left the cottage, the weight of the village's dark secret bore down on her. The air outside felt colder, heavier, as though the shadows of the faceless ones were already closing in. She clutched the journal to her chest, knowing that the battle ahead would be unlike anything she had ever faced, and she wasn't sure if she could win. Eliza stood outside the town hall, the sun sinking behind the rooftops, casting long, ominous shadows across the cobbled street. The journal Mrs. Hartwell had given her was tucked under her arm, its faded leather cover a weighty reminder of the secrets it held. Her heart raced, each beat reverberating in her chest, but she had no choice. She had to confront the council. For days, she had pored over the journal's brittle pages, uncovering fragments of the village's dark history. Names, dates, cryptic references to rituals and agreements made in blood. It all pointed to one truth. The council knew about the faceless ones. They had known for years, and worse, they had allowed it to happen. They had struck the pact, sacrificing their own people for the village's prosperity. Eliza gritted her teeth as she pushed open the heavy door, stepping into the dimly lit hall. The village council was already gathered at the long wooden table, a group of 5 seated in a semicircle as if they were awaiting her. Councilman Merrick, the oldest and most influential of them, sat at the center, his sharp eyes narrowing as he spotted her. "Eliza," he said, his tone neutral but cold, "we weren't expecting you." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "We need to talk." The other council members exchanged uneasy glances. Councilwoman Davis, a stern woman in her 60s, leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting with suspicion. "About what, dear?" Eliza strode forward, pulling the journal from under her arm and slamming it down on the table. The pages fluttered slightly, a gust of air escaping from its brittle spine, as though it were a living thing gasping for breath. "This," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "The pact, the faceless ones, the disappearances. You've known all along, haven't you?" There was a moment of silence, a tense, heavy pause that filled the room like smoke. Councilman Merrick's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, the faintest hint of menace creeping into his gaze. "Eliza, you've been listening to too many old stories," he said, his voice measured. "Whatever Mrs. Hartwell has told you, it's nonsense. There's no pact, no faceless ones. You're upsetting yourself over nothing." Eliza's breath hitched, anger flaring in her chest. "I'm not imagining this. People are disappearing. Emily Calder is gone, and now the Willows are living in her house. People who don't belong here, and they don't even have faces in their reflections. You can't stand there and tell me I'm wrong." Councilwoman Davis sighed, glancing at the others who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Eliza," she began, her tone patronizing, "it's understandable that you're upset. Emily Calder moved away months ago, and the Willow family, they're not human," Eliza interrupted, her voice rising in desperation. "Don't you see? They're replacing us. The faceless ones are taking people and erasing them from existence. And you're letting it happen. You're helping them." The tension in the room thickened, the air almost crackling with it. Councilman Merrick leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. His gaze was cold now, devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "Eliza," he said softly, "there are things you don't understand. The village needs the protection of the faceless ones. Without them, we would have nothing. No crops, no wealth, no safety. This village thrives because of the pact. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good." Eliza stared at him in horror, her blood running cold. "The greater good? You're sacrificing people, your own people. How can you justify that?" "We aren't sacrificing them," Councilwoman Davis said, her voice eerily calm. "The faceless ones ensure that those who are taken are forgotten. It's as if they never existed. It's painless, Eliza. No one suffers." Eliza's stomach twisted with disgust. "No one suffers. You've erased entire families from this village's history. You've let monsters replace them. How can you sit there and pretend that's okay?" Merrick's lips thinned, a shadow crossing his face. "It's not about what's okay, Eliza. It's about survival. The faceless ones are far older than any of us and far more powerful. We made a choice to protect the village at any cost." Eliza's throat tightened, her hands trembling as she slammed her palms on the table. "And what about me? You think I don't know what's happening to me? You think I don't notice people forgetting me, just like they forgot Emily? I'm next, aren't I? You're going to let them take me too." A flicker of something, regret perhaps, passed over Councilman Merrick's face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold indifference. "Eliza, you've drawn too much attention to yourself. The faceless ones don't like to be questioned. It's too late to stop what's coming." Eliza felt her chest constrict, panic rising as the reality of her situation crashed down on her. They weren't going to help her. They were going to let her be erased, just like Emily, just like all the others. And there was nothing she could do to stop it, except fight. Her mind raced, a surge of determination overpowering the fear. She might not be able to trust the council, but she wasn't going to let the faceless ones take her without a fight. She had evidence. She had the journal. And there had to be a way to expose the truth. "You're all monsters," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "You've betrayed this village. You've betrayed your own people, and I swear I'll find a way to stop you. I'll find a way to break the pact." Merrick's eyes hardened. "You won't get that chance." Before Eliza could respond, two men stepped out from the shadows behind the council, men she hadn't noticed when she'd entered the hall. They moved quickly, too quickly for her to react, grabbing her arms and pulling her back from the table. "Let me go," she shouted, struggling against their grip, but it was no use. They were too strong. Her mind raced, panic clawing at her as she realized she was losing. The faceless ones were going to erase her, and the council was going to let it happen. As they dragged her toward the door, she cast one last desperate glance at the council. Merrick watched her, his expression cold and detached, while Councilwoman Davis looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "Eliza," Merrick said quietly, almost regretfully, "it's already done. You're just a loose end." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline surging as she fought to break free. But the more she struggled, the more her energy waned. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening as her body went limp. She felt herself slipping, not just physically but mentally, as though the world around her was starting to forget she existed. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was her own reflection in the polished glass of the town hall's door. Her features were blurred, indistinct, like a smear of paint. Her face was vanishing. She was becoming one of them. Then everything went black. Eliza awoke to the sensation of cold stone beneath her cheek. Her body ached, her limbs stiff and unresponsive. For a moment she lay still, eyes closed, hoping that this was a nightmare, that when she opened her eyes she'd be back in her own bed, safe from the horrors that had begun to unravel her world. But as she stirred, the sharp smell of damp earth filled her nostrils, and the reality of her situation pressed down on her like a crushing weight. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up, blinking against the dim light filtering through the narrow windows of the town hall basement. She was still here, still trapped. Her hands, raw from where the men had grabbed her, shook uncontrollably as she stood. The last thing she remembered was Merrick's cold, calculating gaze, the council sealing her fate with a mere glance. And then, darkness, the faceless reflection. Her breath hitched. She could still see it in her mind's eye, her own face, her features vanishing before her. Was it too late? Was she already becoming one of them? Number. She couldn't think like that. She couldn't let the fear consume her. She reached into her coat pocket, fingers trembling, and found the journal still there, its worn leather cover pressing against her palm. The last piece of her past, the last evidence of the truth. Her heart pounded as she opened it, flipping through the fragile pages for something, anything that could stop this. She'd spent hours reading Mrs. Hartwell's notes, the desperate scribblings of a woman who had witnessed too much, but none of it had told her how to break the pact. The answers weren't here. They had never been in the book. The truth, the final piece of the puzzle, was still out there, waiting. Eliza's vision blurred as tears threatened to spill, but she blinked them away. She didn't have time to cry. Not now. She staggered to the door, pulling at the rusted handle, her body aching with every movement. It was locked. Of course it was locked, but as she pressed her ear to the wood, she could hear voices, muted, distant, but growing louder. They were coming for her, the faceless ones. They were coming to erase her, just like they had erased Emily, and there would be no one left to remember she had ever existed. Her heart raced as she looked around, desperate for a way out. The windows were too small to crawl through, the walls too thick to break. But then her eyes fell on the grate, an old ventilation shaft near the ceiling, barely large enough to squeeze through. It would be a risk, but she didn't have a choice. If she didn't escape now, she would lose herself forever. With every ounce of strength she had left, Eliza climbed onto a rickety chair, her hands scraping against the rough metal as she wrenched the grate free. The voices outside the door grew louder, and she could hear the heavy thud of footsteps approaching. They were almost here. She pulled herself into the narrow shaft, her heart pounding in her ears. It was dark, the air thick with dust, but she crawled forward, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Her fingers scraped against the walls as she inched through the darkness, the sound of her breath echoing in the claustrophobic space. Finally, after what felt like hours, she reached the end of the shaft. It opened into the alley behind the town hall, and she dropped down onto the cobblestones, gasping for air. The night was thick with fog, the village square eerily silent, but Eliza didn't stop. She couldn't. She ran, her legs burning with every step, her mind racing. She needed to stop them. She needed to expose the truth. The council was her first target. They were holding a meeting tonight, the same meeting where they had decided her fate. If she could get there, if she could reveal the pact to the villagers, maybe, just maybe, someone would believe her. Someone would help her. She burst into the village square, her lungs burning with every breath. The town hall loomed in front of her, its doors now wide open, the soft glow of lantern light spilling out into the fog. Eliza could hear voices from inside, the council members speaking in low tones, discussing the next phase of their plan. She didn't hesitate. She stormed through the doors, her chest heaving, her fists clenched around the journal. The council members turned to her, their faces frozen in shock, but it was Councilman Marrick's expression that struck her most. He didn't look surprised. He looked amused. "Eliza," Marrick said softly, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I told you it was too late." "No," Eliza spat, her voice cracking with anger and fear. "It's not too late. I know what you've done. I know about the pact. I know about the Faceless ones." The other council members exchanged uneasy glances, but Marrick merely smiled. "Do you think anyone will believe you? You're already fading, Eliza. The village is forgetting you even now." Eliza's heart pounded, the weight of his words settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Was it true? Had people already started to forget her? She looked around, searching for any sign of recognition on the faces of the villagers who had gathered in the square, but their eyes were distant, their gazes unfocused. No one moved, no one spoke. Marrick stepped forward, his smile widening as he gestured to the crowd. "You see? It's already happening. You're just a ghost now, Eliza. Soon no one will remember you were ever here." Tears stung at her eyes, but she refused to give in to the despair. She wouldn't let him win. She wouldn't let them erase her. Not like this. "I have proof," she shouted, holding up the journal. "This is the truth. This is what you've been hiding from the village. The Faceless ones have been replacing us, stealing people from this town for years. They're monsters, and the council has let them do it." For a moment, the villagers stirred, a murmur rippling through the crowd. Eliza's heart leaped. They were listening. They were starting to hear her. But then, just as quickly, the murmurs died away, and the crowd fell silent once more. Merrick's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Enough of this," he said coldly. "You've caused enough trouble, Eliza. It's time to end this." He raised his hand, and Eliza felt it, a sudden, suffocating pressure. The Faceless ones were here. They were coming for her. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat, as the air around her seemed to thicken. The shadows deepened, twisting and writhing, and she could feel their presence, cold and hungry, reaching for her. "No," she gasped, shaking her head. "No, I won't let you." She clutched the journal tighter, her vision blurring as the world around her darkened. Her own face flashed in her mind again, faceless, blank, forgotten. But as the shadows closed in, a spark ignited in her chest. A fire, a defiance that refused to be snuffed out. With the last of her strength, Eliza raised her voice, shouting into the darkness. I remember everything. You won't take me, I won't be erased." And then, in that moment, the shadows recoiled. The Faceless ones hesitated, their cold grip loosening for just a heartbeat. It was enough. Eliza threw the journal into the fire pit in the center of the square. The flames roared to life, consuming the pages, the truth written in ink and blood. The villagers gasped, and suddenly something shifted. The air seemed to crack, the world itself shuddering as if waking from a long, dark dream. The Faceless ones screamed. It was a sound like nothing Eliza had ever heard before, hollow, haunting, filled with centuries of anger and loss. They began to fade, their twisted forms unraveling, dissolving into the night like smoke. And then, silence. Eliza stood in the center of the square, panting, her heart racing. The villagers stared at her, their eyes wide with shock and confusion. They remembered. They could see her. But something was wrong. Her hands, her body felt light, too light. She looked down, and her breath caught in her throat. She was fading. The faceless ones hadn't taken her. But the cost of breaking the pact was her existence. She smiled, a small, sad smile, as she felt herself slip away. She had won. She had saved the village, but no one would remember her. The last thing Eliza saw before the world went dark was her own reflection in the window of the town hall. Her face, clear and real for the first time in days, smiled back at her. And then, she was gone.